Welcome, everyone. We are going to be having a really great conversation today around climate justice. We're going to be demystifying what climate justice is, what it might mean to different personalities, the different representations, the different backgrounds. And we're also going to be hearing a little bit more about intersectional environmentalism and what that might be. I'm joined by Leah Thomas from Intersectional Environmentalist. And shortly, we are also going to be joined by Janae Lloyd from Worldcentric. And we're going to have a special guest joining us a little bit later as well. So I really want to just jump in and start the conversation a little bit to talk about, what does climate justice mean? What does it mean to me and my work? And then Leah, I'd love to hear a little bit about what it means for you and your work.
Absolutely.
So climate justice, cool. So climate justice for me is it's a term, right? It's something that we've heard in global culture. It's global warming. That's something that we've all gotten used to. And so hearing about what global warming means and what it means for the world, that's something that I think that we've gotten comfortable with. What I think that a lot of us have gotten, have a little bit less comfortability around is climate justice and how climate justice in that conversation really is about the people who are minoritized, the people who are marginalized, the representations that typically don't get invited to the conversation about climate justice, however, are typically more proportionately and more negatively impacted. So I think of things like Flint, Michigan, and how Flint, Michigan here in the US still does not have clean drinking water. When I think of housing developments, and how the government might put housing developments in lower income development areas in unsafe areas with bad water, bad air. And these are types of things that we're seeing not just here in the US, but globally. A lot of considerations are not made for the people and the people that are actually disproportionately affected by what's going on. So climate justice for me really digs into things like gentrification, and are we pushing out the families and the culture of cities and spaces in our communities that had the representations that we seek to be able to help us develop solutions to the problems, but they've been boxed out, they've been priced out, and no other considerations or spaces were made for them. And so for me, climate justice is really the intersectionality of all of these different things and how they really pertain to the people. What about you, Leah?
I mean, that was so beautiful. I don't even know how to follow that up, but very similarly to you, climate justice to me is the intersection between social justice and environmentalism, which are topics that sometimes are siloed within environmental science and sustainability spaces, but they really shouldn't be because they're so deeply intertwined and interconnected. And climate justice explores how different identity aspects, so whether that's race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, on and on and on, might determine different environmental outcomes or how often someone is experiencing climate injustice. So that's everywhere from, lack of access to clean air, lack of access to healthy foods, being placed next to toxic waste sites and facilities. When I was in school, I was doing a lot of GIS. So I was mapping things out and I was testing different identity aspects, like I said earlier, age or wealth or race, and how that related to who gets to have a beautiful relationship with Mother Earth. And unfortunately, time and time again, I saw in a variety of different studies that race and wealth are the largest indicators in the United States of whether or not someone is going to experience climate injustice. So it's so important. When we talk about the climate crisis, it's not a hypothetical future that's going to happen years and years from now. For a lot of lower income and communities of color, they're already living with environmental injustices that are lessening their quality of life. So that's what climate injustice is to me, really just exploring the intersections between identity, social justice, and environmental outcomes.
Yeah, and I want to spend a couple more minutes talking a little bit about intersectionality, right? When I think about intersectionality, we want to introduce the conversation to folks who may not be as comfortable or knowledgeable or understanding of some of the words that we're using. And I like to say that intersectionality is pretty much what it sounds like. It's the cross section, right? We're all not, you don't just look at us and we're like these flat, 2D kind of individuals, right? We have thoughts, we have beliefs, we have feelings. They change as we get older. Some things that are important to us at one point in our life, maybe you get married, maybe you join your life to someone else, maybe you become a parent, or go through different changes in life. And now you have a completely different representation, or you have an additional representation. Now I'm a Black queer woman who now is also a parent. And now I have a completely different outlook on life, and my wants, wishes, and desires change, right? And intersectionality allows space for all of those things. What about you? What do you think about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's this quote by Audre Lorde that I'm totally going to butcher, but it's something along the lines of like, there is no single issue thing because we don't live single issue lives, and siloing things is so silly because that's actually, we're very dynamic human beings, just like you described. Some things we're born with, some things can change, etc. And by siloing those things, then it can lead to some pretty bad outcomes. And that's what Kimberly Crenshaw found, who created intersectional theory. When she was practicing it in a legal system, she kept finding that Black women, and in particular, there were loopholes. So for example, there's a case with General Motors, and General Motors had fired all the Black women specifically, but they kept all the Black men and they kept all the white women. However, when they tried to advocate on behalf of the Black women, the judge at the time said, well, this isn't it's not a civil rights case. This was back in the 80s. This isn't a civil rights case because the Black men are still there, and this isn't a women's issue because the white women are still there. So therefore, the case was dismissed. And there are so many cases where Kimberly Crenshaw and other advocates of intersectional theory kept saying it's so important to consider those overlapping identities and how they might lead to different outcomes, whether it's positive or negative, because you don't want to, see things like that play out that are still playing out today. So I honestly think that intersectionality, with it, things can be even more beautiful. We can be more considerate of people's different identities. And yeah, it just helps you find empathy and learn a lot more about what other people might be going through.
I love the idea around empathy, right? And so I think if we focus on the intersectional spaces, then that's how you're really going to create solutions that are for everyone, solutions that are actually going to be able to help everyone. And when I think about environmental justice and environmental injustice and all of those things in between, I really focus on the most marginalized, right? So if you focus on the most marginalized, the solution for them and for those representations are typically solutions that are going to be able to support everyone. So I like to give people the idea of like, I'm building a building and I really want to be able to create accessibility to my building. I can put stairs there, which are going to be really helpful for anyone who has 100% able-bodied capabilities. However, if I build a ramp, now anyone can get in. Something as simple, like really, really, really rudimentary, that we can make these small changes. And now all of a sudden, but it wasn't until we considered all of those intersections to identify the most marginalized. And that's really what is at the center of climate justice, is what about the most marginalized and what can we do for those folks? And reminding everyone that these changes have to happen, but what is sometimes the most important to large corporations and large businesses, like getting to net zero and sustainable packaging, and those things are very, very important. But to a family who cannot provide clean drinking water for the bottle of their newborn infant, or to a family that is battling cancer that does not have the proper health support systems in order to be able to get through that, those are not the top of mind for them. And so how do we create systems in place that are really going to be able to support everyone? And so that's when where intersectionality really comes into play and really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important to consider. I mean, it should be I feel like it should be a little obvious, but like basic human needs, like people need water, they need access to healthy food, they need clean air. These should be things that are just standard. And it's pretty staggering because I saw the statistic by the Environmental Protection Agency that African American communities in the United States, 70% of those communities are in violation of federal air quality standards. So even the Environmental Protection Agency is like, oh yeah, 70% of these neighborhoods that we're supposed to be enforcing, the air quality is bad. What are we going to do about that? I don't know. And even when you look at white communities, it's somewhere in like the 40s and 50%. So things like that are just basic human needs, that's pretty troubling. And I think it is extremely urgent. And like you said, I think it's incredible, in businesses, they're focusing on going net zero and these things in the future, but they can also put some of that, bandwidth towards really urgent climate justice crises that are happening right now. And I think a way to do that is when we're thinking about climate solutions, with the just thinking strictly through the environmental science and like engineering and innovation lens, that's kind of like the what of climate change, like the science behind it, how we can fix it, etc. But I think it's so important to start focusing on the who in addition to the what, and that's that intersectional environmentalism piece of who needs help now. Who are the people that are being impacted by these environmental injustices? Who are these people that are being impacted by sea level rise, whatever it is, because we don't want to leave people out. And that's why I'm really excited about intersectional environmentalism and climate justice, which again has been around for quite some time. There was a whole environmental justice movement in the 80s and also, some people in the 60s. So I think the most important thing we can do now is find who those voices are and were in the past that we're advocating, learn from them, uplift their work. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. I know there's this new 12-syllable word, intersectional environmentalism, that I keep saying, but there's nothing new under the sun. And I think we can all get together and uplift their voices and really start to prioritize environmental justice and just, do the dang thing.
Do the dang thing. I love that. That's a good segue. You mentioned a couple of things like around majority and what's majority. You said that word, and I'm going to dive in there. So something that we do at B Lab was last year we committed to anti-racism and what that means. And so we didn't just put a bunch of words on the paper. We really wanted to bring some commitments along that. And I think that in the world of business, one thing that we focused a lot on is like the majority. And that makes sense, right? Where's the most impact? Where should we put our efforts in? Because that's going to be the biggest return on our investment. JEDI work is really hard to measure. Justice work is really hard to measure. There's no one size fits all. There's no cookie cutter. I've been trying to tell people, like, we have to get out of the comfortability of best practices in the world of justice and equity, and best practices are really, really hard to come by. It's trial and error, right? We have not lived in a world of equality yet. So we don't know what that looks like. We're literally trying this out. And so we have to lean away from focusing on the majority. Whenever you consider spaces that are typically homogeneous, majority, if you have a mostly white space and you focus on the majority, you're focusing on the white faces and the white spaces and the white experiences. And so we really want to try to figure out a different way to do that. And one way we've done that at B Lab was creating the Climate Justice Playbook. It got its first kind of rendition at a climate justice annual event that we hosted. And we looked to the left and we looked to the right and we realized this is not really a diverse space. And we need to do something about that. And we need to call ourselves out for recognizing that this is not a diverse space. And we need to ask why it's not a diverse space, get some conversations with folks. And we really did our due diligence, not only to work to diversify the space of that event moving forward, but to create the playbook, which does exactly what you just mentioned, Leah, around elevating voices, elevating spaces, elevating people, boots on the ground, real world, real life experiences that is actually happening in the real world. And the hope is that it provides insights, guidance. There are case studies of different companies that have been seeking to advocate climate justice, how it went for them, the good and the bad. We talk a lot about the good, but we don't spend a lot of time on the bad, so to speak. And the hope is that it's really going to assist organizations and individuals to understand that the root cause of climate change a lot of times is really going to be fixed by centering justice and people. And so one of the calls to action in the playbook is, how do companies get to net zero emissions? We talked a little bit about net zero, but net zero can get really complicated to unpack. And introducing my special guest, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, Janae Lloyd, is going to be jumping in to join from Worldcentric, to chat a little bit with us about net zero and how do we unpack that as it relates to climate justice.
Thanks, Ellonda. It's so great to join both of you today. Leah, I love what you said about including the who with the what. That was really great. As a little bit of context, Worldcentric is a leading provider of plant-based compostable packaging for the food service industry, which at the heart of the business is an effort to reduce our reliance on petroleum-based plastics. And we commit 25% of our profits each year to community groups working in areas that are experiencing extreme poverty, which are often those who are the most impacted by climate change. Ellonda was talking about the climate justice playbook and net zero, and the majority of tools given to businesses for mitigating climate change focus on carbon pricing and carbon counting. Within the B Corp community, we use the framework measure, reduce, which is the most critical, and offset. But purchasing offsets can be really tricky, I think. And it's become kind of a quick and easy way to race to zero or to gain carbon neutrality. And although there are some market-based strategies that do benefit some communities, they most often serve as a cheap way for the world's biggest polluters to avoid true ecological reforms and deprive people who can least afford it of their livelihoods, land, and homes. So at Worldcentric, we consciously opt out of going all in on purchasing carbon offset credits, and instead we focus on partnering with organizations committed to climate justice, to removing and reducing carbon while also supporting the most impacted communities. And a large focus of that funding is supporting Indigenous land rights. Indigenous groups across the globe are fighting the exploitation of their land for commodified natural resources. So that's logging, mining, monocultures, and their resistance to that prevents land-based carbon emissions and maintains or increases carbon sequestration. And there are many ways to support Indigenous defenders, but first, we really need to learn how to actively engage in listening. Alex Lucitanate is an Kofán leader and human rights defender. Right now, we're going to hear directly from Alex. This was recorded at the Ceibo Alliance and Amazon Frontlines Organizing Center in the northern Ecuadorian Amazon.
Yo soy Alex Lucitante, soy defensor de derechos humanos y hago parte del directorio de la Fundación Alianza Ceibo. Soy de la nacionalidad Kofán. Alianza Ceibo somos una organización conformada por miembros de 4 nacionalidades, Siona, Siecopay, Guauranis y Kofanes. Nos hemos conformado para la defensa de nuestros territorios y de nuestros derechos. Las nacionalidades indígenas, nosotros tenemos una relación estrecha con el territorio, con la selva, con todo lo que existe. Nosotros milenariamente, ancestralmente hemos vivido en estos territorios. Hemos aprendido de la ciencia, de la medicina que existe en estos territorios y hemos logrado como vivir en armonía con el territorio, con la selva. Todo esto se puede dar siempre cuando nosotros seguimos con este objetivo de seguir conservando nuestra vida tradicional y seguir conservando la cultura mismo, el conocimiento, la ciencia de la medicina. Todo esto nos ayuda a entender y armonizar. Nosotros creemos que los pueblos indígenas somos los conocedores de esta selva, porque somos los que realmente vivimos aquí. Y yo creo que no hay ninguna otra persona, no hay ninguna eh, ningún estado que conozca mejor el territorio que nosotros. Nosotros protegemos plenamente el territorio. ¿Por qué? Porque ahí está el sentido de nuestra vida. Está como la conexión espiritual, medicinal, los alimentos que necesitamos para vivir como pueblos indígenas. Entonces es más que todo esa visión grande que nosotros nos da fortaleza para poder seguir como en esta protección. En esta parte quisiera como empezar diciendo que los pueblos indígenas para el Estado somos la última prioridad en lo que tiene que ver con los derechos, en lo que tiene que ver con la salud, en lo que tiene que ver con la educación. Somos la última prioridad para el Estado, pero somos la primera prioridad para el Estado si se trata de extracción de recursos naturales, ya sea petróleo, minería. Es como el gran riesgo que nosotros estamos viviendo, porque el Estado lo primero que hace es mirar a los territorios indígenas como reserva de esos recursos. Y el primer negociado con las empresas internacionales es nuestro territorio. Y con ese territorio, cuando ese territorio está en riesgo, nosotros los pueblos indígenas también estamos en riesgo. Y cuando los pueblos indígenas estamos en riesgo, el territorio está en grave riesgo también. Y ahí está el gran problema, que no existe un plan desde el Estado de proteger estos derechos, de cuidar a los pueblos indígenas, de cuidar la selva. Lo que ellos están mirando es el recurso que existe ahí. Y ahí está el problema, ahí está el peligro, porque al nivel mundial estamos hablando de que existe un cambio climático, que necesitamos enfrentar a ese cambio climático, pero si es los mismos estados quienes están enfocando a la destrucción de los pueblos indígenas y de los territorios, que son los únicos espacios que nos ayudan a frenar estos cambios climáticos, que nos ayudan a darle sentido a la vida de la humanidad, ¿cómo podemos cuidar? Si no hay ese apoyo, si no hay ese respaldo, si no hay ese reconocimiento. Y también para el mundo occidental, la mayor parte o la gran consecuencia que existe es que cuando los pueblos indígenas hayan perdido los conocimientos, hayan perdido ese camino para proteger el territorio, esa experiencia que tiene, el mundo occidental también va a llegar a perder. ¿Por qué? Porque ya todo ese espacio que nos brinda salud, que nos brinda aire puro, que nos brinda vida, también van a llegar a perder. Todos los ríos van a ser contaminados, toda la medicina que existe y que aún no es conocido por el mundo occidental. Y es por eso que hemos decidido organizarnos, hemos decidido formar jóvenes en liderazgo, en derecho, mujeres en liderazgo y en derecho, para que podamos desde ese lado, junto con nuestras organizaciones, junto con las bases, con las comunidades, poder promover este proceso de resistencia. Hasta este momento hemos construido procesos muy bonitos por medio de la articulación de luchas, no solo en las nacionalidades que estamos aquí en la Alianza Ceibo, sino también con otras nacionalidades de la Amazonía ecuatoriana. Y también entendemos que otros pueblos indígenas y pueblos afros, campesinos, también se están sumando a estas luchas para la defensa de la naturaleza. Yo creo que hemos construido una articulación muy fuerte y estamos ahora mismo con 2 casos en la Corte Constitucional que habla sobre el tema de consulta. Está como para el desarrollo de jurisprudencia, que va a ser como una herramienta muy importante para nosotros seguir protegiendo, no solo para nosotros, sino también para otros pueblos indígenas, como herramienta para protección de los territorios y de nuestros derechos. Y en este caso nosotros seguimos con estos procesos de fortalecimiento de las organizaciones, fortalecimiento de nuestros líderes, para que podamos seguir como haciéndonos más fuerte para esta lucha. Esta no es una lucha solo de nosotros como pueblos indígenas en la Amazonía, tratando de proteger como este último espacio que nos brinda vida, que nos da que nos ayuda a enfrentar el cambio climático. Yo creo que esta lucha es de todos a nivel mundial, porque si nosotros no ponemos un esfuerzo, créanme que los pueblos indígenas podemos tener toda la experiencia del mundo, podemos tener toda la fortaleza del mundo, pero si no todos estamos unidos en esto, siempre va a haber complicaciones, siempre va a haber esa amenaza, va a existir para el Estado, va a ser más sencillo cómo poder llegar a explotar los territorios y destruir todo lo que nos queda ahora. De todas las donaciones del mundo, solo el 2% es para combatir el cambio climático. Y de ese 2%, una mínima parte llega a los pueblos indígenas para la protección de los territorios. Por esta razón, yo quisiera como invitar al mundo, a los países desarrollados del norte, a tener como ese acercamiento con los pueblos indígenas, a tener como esa conexión directa para la protección de los territorios.
I've watched that video several times, and each time it's equally powerful. We can support Indigenous defenders by providing funding for the fight, by reducing emissions at source, and by opposing the brands and banks that are driving exploitation. Also, if you're purchasing carbon offsets, be really intentional. If the projects are on native land, make sure the community has free, prior, and informed consent. You'll find a link to more resources in the chat for how to support Ceibo Alliance, which is where Alex is, and also other Indigenous groups, as well as some more resources for more discussion about carbon offsets.
Thanks, Janae. Alex's message is so powerful, and it also really encourages me to continue to invite different folks to the conversation to learn, right? Storytelling is really important. I think that it allows you to have different ways of communicating and really understand. And also a word that Leah mentioned earlier that I love is empathy. In this work, empathy, and it's hard to understand. We say the word understand, but I don't think it's really about understanding. It's really hard to understand a path that somebody else walks unless you walk that path. But we can build empathy about experiences, and we can build some level of respect for different experiences that folks have. We talk a lot about examples and who gets it right? It's a lot of fun to talk about positivity and how things are going, and that's great. But I think in order to catalyze change, a lot of times it's important to talk about the not so great outcomes, or the outcomes that were not always intentional. Leaders do a lot of work, right? Being a leader is challenging, and it's tough, and it's hard, and admitting whenever you've made a mistake is also difficult. But let's talk about misconceptions. Misconceptions in this work of climate justice. If we seek to do no further harm, what do you see in this work that is intended for good, but often does more harm than heal? And I'll start. I'll start with maybe hiring whenever, or you're just looking to bring other experiences to a conversation. So this might be hiring, this might be partnering with community work, this might be partnering with other businesses, this might be working with grassroots organizations, right? Whenever we're partnering, sometimes we want to diversify spaces. And so we have a lot of really good intentions on creating space, or giving voice, or giving power to other humans. And what I think is important for us to do is really to focus on impact and take the focus away from our intention, because impact is where the actual change happens. And I think that there's a lot of ego that's built up inside of the intent. So if I did not mean any harm, then I should get a pass if I created harm. And we have to understand that we all make mistakes. And sometimes in this journey, when we're learning and we're growing, what we say are mistakes are not. It's part of the process, right? Sometimes not getting things right is part of learning. It's a part of growth. It's a part of being in spaces that you've never been in before. So embracing when things don't go as planned, and really acknowledging that, but moving away from our intentions and being more attached to the outcomes and the impact of the choices that we make to really center humans and people. Anyone, what about Leah? What do you think?
Yeah, I think you said that so well. Yeah, just moving towards a place of accountability culture, because I think in the sustainability space, and I've worked in corporate sustainability, it's been lovely. There's a lot of good people. Like there's a lot, if you care about sustainability, you probably care about the world to some extent. So you're probably an empathetic person. But empathetic and nice people can sometimes get things wrong. And I think it's really important what you said about intentions, because even if you are a well-intentioned sustainability professional, maybe the climate justice and intersectional environmentalist journey, it's not necessarily going to be easy, and there will be mistakes along the way. So some pieces of advice for what we do at Intersectional Environmentalist, even though we are, majority of people of color, LGBTQ plus people, etc., we make mistakes every single day. In our community, everyone wants to be represented in the content that we make. So sometimes they'll comment and say, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And at first we kind of struggled because we felt really defensive of, people, they should understand what we're trying to do. And then we realize whenever people are being defensive, it's usually coming from a place of pain of them not being included. So we as an organization don't have to be another source of pain for them, and to just respond with accountability. Say, thank you for raising this with me. I didn't understand that. I'm going to consider this for the future. When you say you're going to consider it for the future, actually consider it. And usually your content and your efforts will get better if you do consider those things. So that's been a learning lesson. And it's also like, it makes me feel really good when I can be accountable to my community. I can be accountable to my employees that I work with. And it really just makes people feel seen and heard and validated. So I think that's a really important thing to consider in the journey towards, climate justice, making sure you consider accountability, because again, even our org, which is built on the foundation of intersectional environmentalism, we get things wrong. So it's totally okay.
I love that. I love the idea of accountability. And Ellonda, I love the phrase you used about intent versus impact. For people who are on the call that, like me, are white, I think one of the characteristics of white supremacy is thinking that there's one right way. And it talks a lot about paternalism and the belief that those holding power are automatically qualified or even entitled to make decisions, and don't think it's necessary to understand the viewpoint or experience of those the decision impacts. And I see this a lot in philanthropy because we equate money to power, and it's really easy to do unintentional harm when we assume that we know best for someone else. And the opposite of that is to center the voice of those you're serving, like Alex in the video, who has the true power in his relationship to the land. And I think this also ties in with what I was saying before about the importance of listening, as well as just the mind thought of being a continual learner and setting ego aside. If you have influence in your organization over charitable contributions, or even in your own personal philanthropy, I really recommend reading the book Decolonizing Wealth. And there was also a really great article on Grist recently called "Are White People Bad for the Environment?" I'll put the link in the chat, but it was really thought-provoking.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. It was a great conversation. There's never enough time, right? The time always goes really, really fast, but it's a great conversation with you all. I'm grateful to have shared this space with you. And thank you for inviting me to share the space with you and in sharing my insight as well. I really appreciate the invitation. And I'm looking forward to continuing to catalyze change with like-minded individuals just like yourself. So thank you again. Be well.